Welcome to the Stereoactive Movie Club. My name is Jeremiah, and I'm here with Alicia, Laura, Mia, and Steven. And we're going to be talking about the 1953 film Tokyo Story, directed by Yasujirō Ozu. But first, let's introduce ourselves. So, Alicia, other than Tokyo Story, have you watched any movies since we last recorded?
I watched Judas and the Black Messiah this week, which we did already discuss on the podcast. But I'll just say I really, really loved it. I thought it was great, and that's it.
Laura, how about you?
I watched Coming to America.
Like Coming with a 2, the letter.
Yep,
I mean,
that's
the
right.
number 2?
You got
Okay,
it. You
gotcha.
got it. You totally got what they did there. I thought it was very satisfying. As you know, lowbrow, the kind of film you want. It was funny. You can't really capture the magic of the original, but I got everything I needed. I had 2 points of contention that I'd like to mention. Salt and Pepper were in it, and it's frustrating because somehow they just did a Lifetime movie and they've completely erased Cinderella from the whole legacy. And it was just Salt and Pepper in this movie, and it reminded me of that, and it just made me upset. And then at the end, there's, spoiler alert, a wedding scene.
We haven't seen it.
Wedding scene.
Okay.
You don't know who it is that's getting married.
Okay.
And the woman cannot walk in the dress. Like, she's literally immobile, and they could have easily figured out a workaround, but it's just embarrassing for like 5 seconds. And there you go.
Okay. And Mia.
So the reason I was screaming about the spoilers is because we watched Coming to America, the OG one, in preparation for watching Coming to America. And I thought it was great. It was so funny. I haven't seen it since I was a kid. I very much enjoyed it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so now we need to watch the new one.
Yeah, you do.
I thought it held up better to today's standards than Trading Places. I'll say that.
Definitely.
And then I also watched Another Round, the Mads Mikkelsen Danish film that just got a surprise nomination for Best Director at the Oscars. And I also saw Star Trek: The Motion Picture for, I don't know how many times I've seen that before, but I liked it more this time than I did the last time I watched it. I go back and forth on it, but I like it.
Are you going through the Star Trek movies again? Because I thought you did a Star Trek movie last week.
Yeah, I watched Wrath of Khan a couple weeks back, and then, I don't know, I was recovering from a migraine and decided to watch this for some reason. Laura.
I'm really sorry about your migraine. And do you guys know that The Weeknd song where he's talking about I'm the motherfucking star boy, and he's like, he calls it the Wraith of Khan in the breakdown. Girls get loose when they hear the song, and it's just the cutest thing ever.
And Steven, how about you?
I watched the 39 Steps,
Ooh.
which they were doing I have TCM, so I've been watching a lot of TCM movies lately. And that's an Alfred Hitchcock movie. It was made in 1935. I really enjoyed it. I didn't know anything really about it. I've heard about the movie a lot. And it was much funnier than I expected. And it was really kind of a romp and enjoyable. And I was kind of a surprise. I don't know why. But anyway, yeah, I loved it.
Is a romp the same thing as a bop these days? So for those who may not have heard our first several episodes now, when does it go from few to several? I don't know. This is a podcast where the 5 of us are discussing movies that have appeared on Sight and Sound magazine's poll of the quote-unquote greatest movies ever made that comes out every 10 years. And we're basically using it as our own prompt to watch some classic movies ahead of the next poll, which will be out in 2022. We invite listeners to take part in the discussion by watching along and sharing their opinions in our Facebook group, by emailing, or by leaving us a voice message on our anchor.fm show page. And again, this time we're talking about Tokyo Story. But before we get into the history and background of the movie, what did each of us know about the movie going into this? Who's seen it before, if anybody, or what were you expecting, if anything? And Alicia, since you picked this one, why don't you start us off and also tell us why you picked it?
And I had never seen this movie before. I had never heard of this movie before. And I picked it because it was the first movie on the list, because my other 2 picks were already chosen. And I really knew almost nothing about it. I Googled it one time before watching the movie. That's it.
Mia, how about you?
I'd never heard of Tokyo Story before. I kept confusing it in my head with In the Mood for Love, which is set in Hong Kong, not Tokyo. But yeah, had no idea. And then I just knew it was about a family. So then that also kept making me think of that movie that Awkwafina was in that I'm blanking on the name now.
The Farewell.
The Farewell, yes. Which is excellent if folks haven't seen it.
Okay. And Steven, how about you?
I'd never heard of this movie before, and so I had no expectations walking into it.
There you go. Laura, how about you?
Well, I worked at a video store in the 90s, and I read up and have written for film blogs. So I've gleaned that Ozu is an important director, and that if I, didn't give it its due and time, I would just be a big loser sneeze. So that's what I knew before going into this.
I'm pretty much in the same boat. I'd heard of Ozu. I actually had thought I'd seen one of his movies before, but then looking back at his filmography, I hadn't. So this is my first one. But I knew he was like one of those important filmmakers that filmmakers and critics both really like, and I just needed to get around to it. So this was a great excuse to do that, and I'm glad to have done it. Released in 1953 and very loosely based on a 1937 American film called Make Way for Tomorrow, Tokyo Story follows a retired couple living in a town in the southern part of Japan as they visit their grown children who mostly live in Tokyo. Over the course of the film, the couple's children have trouble managing time to spend with their parents, while their daughter-in-law, the widowed wife of the couple's son who died in the war, does all she can to make them feel welcome and cared for. Eventually, the couple return home and the mother falls ill and dies soon after, prompting all the children to gather in their hometown to mourn. Directed by Yasujirō Ozu, whose career as a director began in 1927 with silent films, it is considered emblematic of the themes and style he'd already developed and would continue to develop over the course of the next decade before he died, and also includes many actors he worked with often, perhaps most notably Chishū Ryū as the retired patriarch and Setsuko Hara as the caring daughter-in-law. Even though Rashomon, directed by fellow Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa, had introduced many people in the West to Japanese cinema a few years before, Ozu's work was deemed, quote, too Japanese by some, including, I read after I wrote this, the studio itself that made the movie. And it did not begin to gain attention in the West until a few years after this film's release. Filmmaker and critic Lindsay Anderson, after seeing it in London in 1957, wrote a review for Sight and Sound magazine titled 2 Inches Off the Ground, likening the film to the idea that to achieve a Zen state is to experience the world in the same way as before, but feel as if you're 2 inches off the ground. And the film became more popular in the United States after a screening in New York in 1972. Newsweek's review said it was, quote, like a Japanese paper flower that is dropped into water and then swells to fill the entire container with its beauty. The film has been on the Sight and Sound Critics Poll of the greatest films ever made 3 times, number 3 in 1992, number 5 in 2002, then back to number 3, again in 2012, just behind Vertigo and Citizen Kane. And the Sight and Sound Directors Poll ranked it as the greatest film ever made in 2012, just ahead of 2001: A Space Odyssey and Citizen Kane, which tied for second. And for a bit of context about what movies were popular here in the United States when Tokyo Story came out in Japan, From Here to Eternity was the big Oscar winner from 1953, while CinemaScope biblical epic The Robe was the top-grossing movie in North America. So Alicia, since this was your pick, again, why don't you start us off with your thoughts on the film? Did it meet your expectations or live up to your memories of it?
Yeah, I loved this movie. I really, really ended up liking it. It took me a little while to get into it because it is very slow paced. But once the story really started to unfold about halfway through, and then the way it ended, I really, really, really enjoyed it. I kind of thought that the slow pacing in the beginning, it kind of felt to me, having visited Japan once, there's a lot of like formality and etiquette. There's a lot of like politeness. It's very, very important there. Like there's no litter on the streets and there's no trash cans on the streets. People line up to get on the train. Everything is very sort of ceremonial. And I felt like there was a lot of that in the beginning of the film. And that kind of made it a little bit difficult to understand what was going on or why I should be paying attention to what was going on. But once that started to drop away and the conversations got more real between everybody, I just thought it was really moving, and I enjoyed it. The biggest question I had, though, after I was finished with it, was what do you all think drove Noriko, the daughter-in-law, to be more solicitous of the parents than their own children? I wasn't sure if it was like a shared grief over the loss of her husband, who was their son, or do you think she felt guilty that she didn't grieve his death more because they had mentioned a few times that she was probably happier without him being around? Or do you think she was sort of hung up on him and could move on? Just wondering everybody's thoughts on that.
I mean, without getting too personal, I thought a lot about that. And it's just, she was such a beautiful character. So I don't want to take anything away from her humility or how she acted. But it's a lot easier to have compassion and unbiased feeling to the aged people who are getting older than when you grow up with them. And the way the story was told, and how we learned the father was a drunk and he wasn't always that nice to the mom. It was all these just very subtle. The film was just incredibly subtle. I think the kids just being damaged growing up under that made it so much harder to react. So I think it was just her distance from those times that made it easier. She was just being human, whereas it almost seemed like the kids were just not. They were being just complete selfish brats.
I don't know. I felt like maybe it was a little bit of a facade on her part, because there were certain times, and I don't know if it was just with the storytelling, she would just smile and she would say these things that were just such an anathema to like how you really felt like she was feeling inside. Like I think it was just like about life being a disappointment, and she sort of said it with like a glazed smile on her face. So for a while I was thinking like maybe she was just one of those people that knew how to do the right thing, and she knew how to act in society for older people, and that was kind of the pushing thing with her. So she decided that she was going to, be a really generous person, and that's where she kind of stopped. But she never really considered her own feelings about it at any time. It was more like being solicitous, and so it's like she did like them, but I felt like a lot of it was just her internalized way of dealing with things. It was just like she felt like she needed to put this forward because she felt like she needed to be a nice person, because she kept coming back and saying that she felt like she wasn't, but it wasn't outwardly. You never saw anything like that about her, even in private or even when she was at her job. So for me, I felt like it was very internal for her, and even the outside people didn't get to see
So
it.
to Alicia's question, do you think it was guilt that was partly driving her, Stephen?
I think maybe that would, maybe she felt like she needed to put this up even though she didn't miss her husband at all. But she did like them because they seemed like they were sweet people, or they just needed it, knowing that they weren't getting it from, the mom and dad weren't getting it from their own children with the visit. So she felt like she needed to step it up a little bit. But yeah, I think you're right. You're probably right about that.
I think what you said, though, Laura, makes a lot of sense, too, as a potential possibility. I think it makes sense that basically what I thought you were saying was that, like, when you don't grow up with someone, it's easier to like them in their old age, right?
Yeah.
So I definitely think we've all probably had that experience and can relate to that in some way. Like, you don't know all the ins and outs of what made them a complicated person, so it's easy to just see them for the more surface level niceties that they might have. And she might have this romanticized view of them, not really living near them or having spent much time with them, seemingly even. It doesn't seem like she's seen them since her husband died or since the war, maybe. I don't think that's entirely clear, right? But I also think the other side of that, flipping it around, is that the parents, like Alicia, I think you were saying that they, I forget exactly how you said it, but it seemed to me like they were trying to make her feel better too. Like I'd never necessarily believed that they thought their son was a piece of shit. Like they kind of made it sound like. I thought it was maybe that they were like, oh, we don't want you to feel bad, so we're saying this so you don't feel bad about moving on. Like just think of him that way so you can move on from him. But I also, again, like I don't think that's something that's there in the text of it, but it's something that you could interpret in. And that's what I kind of like about the movie, is that the whole thing is sort of open to interpretation based on your own experience and feeling.
Mm-hmm. There's so much that just doesn't get said, or that gets said in these very oblique ways, and it is kind of up to you to sort of put your own emotions into that, which actually I loved.
Yeah, I thought about it from like a few different perspectives. I definitely agree. I think it's always easier to be nice to people who aren't related to you. And I think, you know, no matter what, like, because I don't know if they ever said how long she and her son were married for before he died, but I know it's been 8 years since he's been missing, at least. But like, you're always going to be more polite to like your mother-in-law than your own mom, no matter how long you've been part of their family or something, I think, for most people at least. And so I think that is definitely part of it. I also thought that in this way, you know, so much of this movie to me was about, okay, it's post-war, post Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There, you know, all these Western values and ideals are coming to Japan. So people are more focused on their careers. Like, I don't know, and I've never been to Japan, but this is, I imagine, one of the first generations to like move so far away from their families. Like, I was like, oh, wow, like all the kids pretty much have moved to Tokyo, to the big city where there's jobs and economic opportunity, which, you know, happens all over the world. And so to me, the children represented very much like this, the new generation, forward looking, not looking back towards their parents, not looking back towards the past. And I kind of felt like with her character, with Noriko, that she maybe was still like stuck in the past because of her husband dying or going missing at this past point. So in a way, she was still this like tie towards the past and was acting in that way then. Not that she was necessarily conscious of it, but that's why she felt so loyal to the parents and was like more considerate of them and was like putting this family ahead of her job throughout the film.
I also thought maybe because she has experienced the grief of losing her husband, and so she kind of is already disappointed by life, that she's a little more sympathetic to people that are older and also a little bit disappointed with life, which I don't think you can help. I think just getting older, that happens. I think there's a lot of talk about their kids disappointing them and the grandkids being kind of rude and stuff. But in the end, I think everybody's kind of disappointed with life when they're older, and she's already kind of experienced that. So maybe that was part of it too.
I thought that was a good point, though, Mia. I hadn't thought of it that way, of like she's basically stuck in the pre-war mindset and kind of represents that. I could see that, though.
Can I say too? I was shocked and appalled by how rude the grandchildren were.
Oh my God, they're brats. I wanted to smack them.
Me too, from like the get-go too. Like,
but I really loved how
it.
they dealt with it in the script. And they're like, some people like their grandchildren better than their children. Who do you like better?
Yeah.
I think I like my children better, even though they're not so great. I'm paraphrasing.
Well, I think you bringing that up, Laura, reminds me that one of the things I found interesting about the way this movie unfolded was it felt like so much of the movie was them avoiding saying things and still communicating that somehow in between the lines. And so you're able to kind of get on the same page with them, and then they might say it later, but you're like already know that that's there, you know? And I thought it was just an interesting way to tell a story about people, of kind of letting you catch up to them before being so explicit about it, but sometimes being explicit at the same time, just later down the road. I thought it was interesting.
It unfolded.
Yeah.
It was like that Japanese flower that guy said.
Yeah.
I'd still like to know everyone's straight up take of the film.
What is yours?
Well, it was subtle. I agree with Alicia that it took some getting into. Like, you had to, I had to pause and really just let myself get taken through the film. The camera didn't move much. I really got into it in the sense that it was such a well-told story with such relatable themes that it's just doesn't matter that it was in the 50s. This is a story that could be told anywhere at any time. was really interested in what I learned was called the pillow shots, quote unquote, that a critic who was reviewing Ozu noticed and then coined the term, because he has all these, they're very similar to establishing shots, but in Ozu, the way he does it in sort of a poem, that he terms it pillow shots. And I think that's such a beautiful term, because there was always this sort of interlude of shots that made it just quite beautiful. And the way the scenes were as well, there was no fear of the silence in between sentences or pauses. It reminded me contemporary, like, of Jarmusch and how he makes films a lot. And I like that about it as well. Do I want to like party with this film again? And is it my desert island movie? No. Mm-hmm. But I definitely appreciated a lot of it and learned a lot from it.
Kind of similar to Laura and Alicia. Like, I thought it was so good. Definitely a masterpiece of cinema. It definitely took me a little while to get into it. It's slow, and we watched it in 2 chunks because we started watching it Friday night, and just after like an hour or so, I was like, okay, like if we're going to talk about this, I need to come back to this tomorrow morning when it's light outside and I'm a bit more alert. But yeah, I mean, I just thought it was like very meditative, very beautiful. I feel like the lingering on these different shots, you kind of have that experience where you start to zone out a little bit and then come back to it and zone out again. And I thought all the family dynamics and the way that so much is left unsaid, you could just interpret so much into these different interactions. And I kind of feel like, and everyone has some kind of weird family dynamic or whatever. And I was like, okay, no matter what your story is, you could probably read it into like one of these characters. Did I see my own family in this? I'm not going to say in case they're listening to this podcast. But yeah, I just thought it was like so beautiful. And another thing I wanted to say too is, I think, Stephen, you were saying like she would smile so much when she was saying these things that was so incongruous. I noticed other characters doing that too. So I just assumed it was a Japanese cultural thing of like, even though you're saying something that's like unpleasant or kind of negative or something like that, you're just still gonna smile. So I don't know, like, Alicia, I know you've been to Japan, or other people know more if they noticed that or thought about it and stuff too.
I didn't have to, unfortunately. I never had to deal with anything in Japan that was like about family grief or anything like that. So I don't know, but everybody was very, very friendly and polite when I was there.
Yeah, I was wondering if it was just like a translation thing. Like if I'd actually spoken the language, would it have translated differently? Because there's some things that were said, they're just like, wow, is that really what she said? Or, I just was thinking maybe that was it. But overall, back to what the movie kind of represented and was, I think that's what I liked most about it. What Mia said is just like everybody saw their family in this, no matter who it was or how many people are in your family. You've seen people like this. And unfortunately, most of my parents passed away, and in certain respects, a lot of that, a lot of what had happened in that movie kind of reminded me of different stages of grief for everybody. So I feel like a lot of it was sort of like that. It was just sort of like people were understanding that, time isn't forever, and how you deal with it is sort of something that you dealt with as it happens instead of gradually. So it was just kind of an interesting way to kind of unfold everything with the stories. It's just sort of like everybody's reactions were different. So I enjoyed it.
I had the same issue, Stephen, about because my father passed in 2015. And I felt like one of the bratty kids, honestly, because I had such a strange relationship with him, and there's all this water under the bridge that's just never there's no such thing as closure when it comes to certain things. But there were hundreds of people there that were just constantly just telling me how he had such a positive effect on their lives as a sponsor in meetings, and just so many accolades, so much love going around, that it sort of watching this film made me relive a lot of those moments, and that wasn't easy.
I felt the same as well.
Yeah, I also really enjoyed it, and I didn't know what I was expecting going into it. I knew that Ozu, what little I did know of him, was basically that his movies are sort of like, I don't even know if deliberate is the right word, but they're a different pace than what you might be used to if you grew up on Hollywood movies. And I really enjoyed it though. It took me a little bit, as Mia was saying, to kind of connect with it. But once I did, it was sort of almost like a retroactive thing where at some point I was like, oh, I'm really into this. I didn't realize I was. And it sort of made the whole thing kind of catch up for me, if that makes sense. And it's also rare just for me these days to find like a classic movie that I can watch for the first time and be like, how did I not see this before? Because I've just like watched a lot of the ones on this list that we're going from, especially. So, and this was the first one in this series that I haven't seen before. And it was just sort of like, it's nice to just be able to see something new sometimes or something unfamiliar and enjoy it. And I really liked that about it, that it's just different than a Hollywood movie.
Yeah,
I love that too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like how the storytelling just sort of unfolded on itself. It's just like you had to really, because I struggled to pay attention at first because I was getting used to how everything was kind of structured, and it was completely different than anything else I'd seen. So after I got used to it, it was more character driven than I liked, and I liked the dialogue. So I did pay attention to it a lot more, and I paid attention to more of the deliberate, close-ups of people. You really got to study their faces and understand their emotions a little bit more than you would if it was just a movie that was like overpowering with different angles and music was going all over the place. It was a better told story, I think, because it was so character driven.
I was fascinated by how much housekeeping was done in this. I mean, these mostly interior shots, except when we were doing the pillow shots, for what I remember of the film, except when the grandmother took the brat for a walk. But there's so much folding and in real time dusting and walking up and down the stairs, and just the narrowness of each like abode was just really interesting.
I was obsessed with their dusting, actually.
There's so much dusting.
It was so cool. So they have these, for people besides the five of us that might not have seen this movie, they have these like, maybe foot-long sticks with then fabric tied to it, and they just go around like not like dusting like we do, but like hitting everything with them. And like every character does it, I think, at some point, or maybe not the the matriarch and the patriarch, but like all the younger women do it. And so it's clearly like this is how they dust in Japan, or at least how they did it in the 50s. But yeah, I was just very, very into that. So I'm glad that you noticed too, because I said something about
How many of us dusted our houses after we watched this movie? I'm just curious, because
No.
I know I did.
I did not.
I went out and bought a duster.
I want a Japanese duster. I'm not doing
do it that way.
That.
I have too much junk
badly?
to do it that way. It would just, everything would go flying, so I couldn't do it.
I was just like, you dirty bitch, go get a duster.
Who did you guys think was like the sort of the rudest of their children? Sort of the worst of the plot? I thought the eldest daughter was, for me personally.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the grandchildren. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so did I.
Yeah, me too.
No, their children, their adult children.
I agree. I thought that she was. I just thought she was such an asshole like the whole time. And when she told them they couldn't stay there because she was having a meeting in their room, I was like about to lose my mind in rage. Because like the son to me just seems sort of the son that's mainly in the movie, not
The doctor?
Yeah, the doctor. Mm-hmm. He just more seemed to me like just like kind of like not with it the whole time. Like it was just like kind of distracted and stuff. But I was like, okay, he has these kids, and his wife seemed more like, interested in like being a good daughter-in-law to the parents and stuff. So I was kind of like, okay, he's just maybe like a man, and like to be stereotypical about that. But yeah, the beautician salon owner woman, I just thought, and then even her reaction, and I know there's like probably like so much buried trauma there, but even when the dad comes back and is drunk, like she's just so like, oh my God, like, and I get it, but
She's gone through it a lot though, don't you think? Like it felt like she was almost regressing into being a kid, because she brought it up a few times before then. Yeah. So when that happened, she was just like, here we go again. And he's visiting. He can't be on his best behavior.
Yeah.
So
I noticed that the families were essentially patriarchal, except for all of their children were very strong-minded. Like that woman, the beautician, Shig, or however you say her name, she was in charge of him. She was in charge of the household. She ate the cakes. that he bought
Mm-hmm.
for the family. You know, the doctor wouldn't let his wife leave the house to take them out. You know, they and Kaizo in Osaka, he also was just completely 100% all in his own head and what he needed to do, and basically missed his mother's death.
Mhm.
So they were
Mhm.
all such strong, selfish personalities. So it was just fascinating to me.
I think, though, the right answer is the dead son is the rudest for being dead.
Missing. He doesn't even have the consideration to be dead.
I mean, really.
It's just a mystery.
Yeah,
That's true.
yeah. They're not even sure he's dead. He's just probably dead.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, they said they never. Yeah, they were just assuming he's dead. He could be, living somewhere.
Yeah, he might be
with a
that
new
guy
wife.
who was still alive on an island thinking they were still fighting the war until like 2 years ago or whatever.
He's the Don Draper of this story. He
Yes.
took someone else's.
Maybe. I thought for the
Identity.
record too that the oldest grandson was definitely the rudest. He's older,
yeah.
he knows better. And I was like shocked by the rudeness, especially since I know how much Japan and Japanese culture, like, you respect your elders. And so I just couldn't believe that this is, I think, the first time they're meeting their grandparents. And I get it. Like, I was a brat to my grandparents. My grandmother, the one who's still alive, probably still thinks I'm a brat. Like, I get it that that's how kids act. But I was just so shocked at how they were acting, and that the parents were like, stop it, but like weren't really interceding at all.
No,
Yeah.
there was no discipline there.
Yeah, I was surprised by that too. I mean, my mom would be of that same generation that the kids are from, parents fought in the war. But like, if she had ever spoken that way to her own grandparents, I know there's no way she would have gotten away. There's no way her parents would have just been like, relax, calm down, go in another room. Like, not a chance. And me neither. Not me neither.
Don't you think that was sort of indicative of like their whole family dynamics? It was sort of
Mhm.
like this had also happened when those kids were little, and that's why they are the way that they are now, because they can't seem to be able to parent correctly like that. And
Exactly.
stop it. I don't know. That's what I thought when I saw them. It was just sort of like, oh, this is like a story that's going to continue. And once
Yep.
they have kids, they'll be the same way. And then their parents are going to talk about them like that. So
I thought it was kind of also indicative of the sort of the story they were trying to tell about the westernization of things. I think we kind of touched on that a little bit earlier too. Yeah, I thought it was part of that. And I was also thought it was interesting how some of the women were wearing kimonos almost all the time, and then other ones were wearing like westernized clothing most of the time. I wasn't sure. At first I thought, oh, the younger kids will all be wearing westernized clothing, but then the oldest daughter wasn't. So I was kind of curious about that choice too.
I think there's sort of a uniform that you're supposed to wear to an office. I think
maybe.
Mariko was not at work. I think she wore more traditional clothes, or at least that was how I took it.
But when she was like at the funeral, well, I mean, when she came home, when she came to the village before the mother actually died, she was just wearing, maybe she was just still wearing her work clothes, but I don't think we saw her, even when they went out on the town, she was wearing like Western clothing.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that was a work thing or what.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
That pops a hole in my whole she's stuck in the past thing, because she's wearing all these modern clothes.
Maybe the other daughter is stuck in the past because she's the one that does wear the kimono, and she seems to have a lot of those childhood resentments still festering.
Yeah.
Right.
mm.
And it was interesting too with the beautician salon, the times when they show her having a client, it's very like pin curls, like these very
Mhm.
1950s Western hairstyles. And she had short, kind of wavy hair too. But anyways, yeah, it's like, obviously this beauty salon with this modern American hairstyles. But yeah, the owner, who I agree totally wears the pants, like is very much equal to, I assume the brother who is a doctor was the oldest brother. As he seemed kind of like the boss of everybody else. But, when they're making plans to like go to the funeral and stuff, or go to rush to their mother's side, it was very like, they're clearly equals figuring this out together. Like he's not her older brother telling her what to do. And she's also not consulting her husband about any of it.
Yeah. And they're making the spa reservations. Like she was the one who kind of
Mm.
spearheaded that whole thing, and he went along with it. So that's the dynamic I think they always had. It seems like.
So I had a question. So related to what I was saying before about this not feeling like a Hollywood movie, like when we discussed the Magnificent Ambersons, Laura was calling that a melodrama, which I think is correct. And in so many ways, I think this is the antithesis of a movie like that. So I'm wondering which aspects of either the storytelling or craft that are different from what we may be used to, everybody took note of, and whether those differences were things you appreciated, which it sounds like is probably the case, or somehow made you disconnect from the film, or maybe it was one then the other later on.
Yeah, I think just like what I already said, I think the pacing was, and also I think Laura mentioned too, just like the sort of
Mm-hmm.
the stillness of the shots and it being kind of the camera kind of being low to the ground or something. It did make it a little hard to concentrate. I think the subtitles too, for me personally, like it forces me to like stare at the screen a little bit, which I don't necessarily always do when I'm watching English movies. So yeah, that was definitely different. It did make it a little harder for me to figure out what was going on at first. But eventually it worked. It all worked for me.
I definitely thought it was very, I mean, I liked it more than the Magnificent Ambersons, and I definitely thought it was very anti that in all of these ways. I mean, there's never a big emotion. I mean, there are emotional scenes, but there's not like, and there's no crying. There's no, I guess, well, okay, I'm lying. I guess when the night that the daughter-in-law and the mother bond and they both lay there with the tears streaming down the daughter-in-law's face.
And the funeral.
And the
Funeral is
funeral,
interesting.
yeah. But there's no like big, at least in my opinion, no big like climactic scene. There's not like some showdown between the generations. Like the parents, the grandparents slash parents are never like, oh, what the heck? Like, why are you being so shitty to us? We came all this way to see you and stuff. Like, there's no big thing like that. So there's no, in my opinion, melodrama, even though there certainly is plenty of drama. I also felt very much like watching this, like, I didn't feel like I was watching a movie for a lot of it. I felt like I was just watching people living. Like it just felt so natural and flowing and all of that. Whereas, like I said, when we talked about Magnificent Ambersons, I felt like the whole time I was like in this like fever dream where I was like, why is everyone overreacting? Like, why is there this big thing? Why aren't people just like talking to each other? And with this one, it just kind of felt like, oh, everything is like flowing, even times when I was like, oh my God, talk to each other, because this is like not a good family dynamic here.
Yeah, I felt like the pace was just deliberate, and everything that was said was deliberate. I never felt like there was filler at all. It just felt like a story. It didn't feel like there was an arc necessarily. It was just sort of like, this is kind of a snapshot, even though something dramatic happens at the end. It still is sort of like they're living and they're going to continue to be this way. There wasn't a catharsis where like the older daughter was suddenly like, wow, I should be a better person. Like there was never anything like that. She was who she was. And we understand why she was the way she was. And maybe that was what was best about it. It was just like you sort of understood why these kids were the way they were and the way that the world is the way that it is because of how they were, the parents were.
Stephen, I find it interesting that you say there's no filler. Because I mean, I think that's like sort of a derogatory term, so I wouldn't call this stuff that, but I think some people would see those pillow shots that Laura was talking about as filler. I think some people would see the fact that the way they go from scene to scene or even shot to shot sometime is instead of cutting where you normally would in a Hollywood movie, there's always like this extra beat where you're going to watch this person leave the room and then we're going to sit there for a second. You wouldn't do that in a Hollywood movie. And I think so much of that goes to what makes this movie work and gave us the effect that it seems like we all had from it, of like all that stuff is getting out of the way of the people and them just being there and you watching them. You know, it's sort of like taking away the trappings of a movie as we know it, the formal trappings of a movie in so many ways that I just found it to be interesting and disorienting at first. Like especially with the houses, like watching them go from room to room and up the stairs and down the stairs, I was like, I have no idea where they are. The way they cut the movie, it crosses the 180-degree line that's like of editing where it doesn't seem continuous. It just seems like they're going all over the place. But once you get used to it, it's just kind of fascinating to watch and really works.
filler is an interesting way to talk about what was happening in terms of the time of the beat. While someone leaves the room to go upstairs, we wait until they get upstairs before the shot begins. I think it was just sort of a realistic approach to making it.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to the pace of the film, as opposed to potentially calling it filler. Not that you were using it in a derogatory way at all.
No, I'm saying most people would call that filler
Oh,
if they
I
weren't
see.
into this
Yeah.
movie, but it doesn't feel like filler here. That's kind of
No.
what I was trying to say. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, there's no trappings of there's nothing reductive about the film. It was all just laid out in real time for us. It's
Right.
great.
Especially with this conversation about, filler or not filler. They never show any of their train journeys anywhere, I don't think. Maybe there's one shot at some point, but I don't think there is. And which, since so much of the story is like the times the train are arriving and when are they going to arrive and who's meeting them where and all of this, like never a shot on the train. And then also they don't show when the mom gets sick on the train and has to get off, and this whole turning point of the film when it goes from just being about their visit to Tokyo to like, oh, their mom is, very ill and potentially dying. I just thought it was so interesting that like there's shots of people, okay, you got to see them walk up the stairs, you got to see this, you got to see that, which I appreciated and liked, but then these like huge parts of the film are also left out. Obviously like artistic choice of the director, but it's just interesting that that's what they chose.
And I thought it was how Keizo was then introduced, but to lay out the story, the third act in that way from this new character was surprising. And I never really thought of the fact that they didn't show any of the train stuff before. I think that's so smart that you noticed that. I know that I appreciate that because I get so anxiety ridden whenever I have to go anywhere. So I was able to just keep the calm pace of the film.
There is one shot on the train at the very end, which was I think it was probably my favorite shot, when Noriko is leaving the town to go back to Tokyo, and she has the watch that the father-in-law had given her, and she's just sitting on the train. And you also see the train. You see the train itself leaving the town, running through the town, and like leaving and going back to Tokyo. And that, I thought that was very sort of indicative of just like, yeah, this way of life is sort of dying. These people are dying. She's leaving. She's going back to like the modern, city and that life. And I thought it was really sad. And that shot really affected me for whatever reason.
It started with that train shot too. Like,
yeah, at the beginning.
It was like it recurred throughout the movie.
What did everybody think of it's called the tatami mat shot, which basically, like, I think Alicia was talking about it before, sort of everything is sort of shot from a low angle as if you were sitting on one of those mats with them. Like, basically everything is shot that way.
I think it was at the beginning when I was sort of getting used to how the shots were. I just sort of say, this is what the director decided to do. And I felt like it was like, I keep saying the word intimate, but it felt like you were part of the family just by being that low to it. And I accepted it as, everybody was sort of spatially like laid out so that it felt like you were almost watching them on television or you were part of it. So I liked it a lot more that way. And even when you did get the close-ups of people, it still felt like that. So I just liked how that was shot.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I didn't realize it while I was watching it, that that's what was going on. And then I guess I looked at the Wikipedia or something afterward and I read it and I was like, oh, yeah, that's another thing that was like throwing me off a little bit, I think, from the beginning. But I think, yeah, in retrospect, it does sort of put you on the same, it's almost as if you're a person that's sitting down in their room observing or being with them. I liked it.
That's why I liked when they'd leave the room and come back or go other places. I just felt like I was really following along, like I was part that, I was there as well. So I just like that way that they kind of told the story, or when you saw different places or rooms.
I know you guys mentioned close-ups, but what I noticed were there's a lot of two-person shots, like close medium shots of two people talking or sitting next to each other. And it was all on that same length, the level of where their eyes were of sitting down. And I've never seen anything quite like that before.
There were a lot of shots of two people facing the same direction, but not each other, but having conversations while they're facing, like they're both looking out the same window and talking to each other while they're both looking out the window or looking at the sea or whatever it is. And that's not something that you see very often either.
Yeah. I liked them when they were both kneeling down, like the parents, and they were talking to each other, but they were kind of like next to each other. I think that happened at the very beginning of the movie. And,
Right.
you know, I just really liked the way that was laid out. It just was much more interesting than some of the other ways that I've seen in Western movies that would have played out. I really liked it.
Yeah, I loved the dynamic between the old couple. I just thought they were like so sweet. And I assumed, you know, because I think they said towards the end, she's like in her late 60s. So like, you know, maybe he's a few years older or something. So they've probably been together for like 40 plus years. And I just thought, as like horrendous as their children were, that they were so sweet to each other and like just so kind of accepting and like, you know, I mean, which for better or worse, but like the mom, when he goes off and gets drunk, is just kind of like, oh yeah, okay, whatever. Like, oh, he used to drink a lot. And, you know, so maybe there's some like willful looking away from the bad spots. But I kind of feel like if you want to stay married to someone for however long, you do kind of have to do that. And so I just thought they would like... Says someone
okay,
who's
guys,
been married for 3 months. 4 months. Sorry, Jeremiah.
Erasure.
But yeah, I just thought that like they were, and I think those scenes of them sitting side by side and still like talking to each other just were, I don't know, it really touched my heart a lot. It was very sweet.
Yeah, I did wonder what their youthful dynamic was, because
I wondered that too.
Yeah, because if he was drinking a lot, and I felt really bad for the mother pretty much throughout the whole movie, because I mean, obviously, like you feel bad for both of them when the kids are kind of dismissive or can't spend time with them or whatever. But then pretty much the first thing that the daughter says to her is, "Oh, you've gotten fatter." And, oh, you were fat when I was young too, and I was very embarrassed by you.
Yeah.
Who
She broke the chair.
does that? Yeah, she broke the chair. Why would you bring that up? Why would you say that? And then she's just so sweet, and all these things just kind of happen around her and happen to her. And yeah, I
she was sort of the punching bag.
Yeah. And then she died. It was very sad for her.
Well, and the more I think about it, I think, well, maybe it's just a lot of anger for her letting all this stuff happen all these years and not being more proactive. So now they can just walk all over her.
Well, in a way, it felt like at the end, the dad was in a worse position, because they were just like, well, if mom had lived and dad had died, we would have taken the mom to Tokyo. But, you know, now he's alone and everybody's like, you're just going to be alone. It's just going to be all you. And that to me it's of course, dying is the worst thing that could happen to you, but it just felt like his decline was going to be just like not seen by anybody, and he was just going to be there.
They do have that youngest daughter that lives with them, so she's still at least there with them.
And the nosy neighbor.
Yeah, the neighbor came by and said, like, you know, you're going to be alone, right? Like they felt like she was sort of saying that.
Well, and that's what I kind of thought, like going back to the, like, they're smiling even while they're saying these things that are like really sad or not very kind or just not something you would have like a huge grin on your face about. Like it was kind of like that. So I was like, okay, is this just this, like, you say it in this way to lighten it or something like that? Even though, again, I'm not an expert on Japanese culture. Please, someone out there listening to this who does know, let us know. This is just my assumption
let
here.
us know.
Yeah. There was some scene where the mom was like, it's a treat to sleep in my dead son's bed. And that I was really like, maybe there's a translation thing, or maybe that's like culturally something that's, but for me, it just really took me out of it. So there were certain things that I was curious, like what it really we're trying to say. And maybe there is something.
I did wonder about some of the translation stuff. I was kind of losing my mind at the end because they kept being like, oh, she must be really sick. And I was like, yeah, the damn telegram said critical, like get thee on the train. Like, oh my God. And we were like kind of laughing about it. And I was like, okay, yeah, we just chalked it up to like translation error with like the words the English words they chose for the subtitles.
But I think it was also maybe that they just didn't want to go. So they're like,
is
it serious? Or can we just stay here in Tokyo and live our lives? Like
Yeah.
I think there was some of that.
True.
It's like, I keep bringing my own personal thing about that, but I remembered when my mother was like, she wasn't going to make it, and I was going to the funeral, and I was like, or I was going to see her, and I was like, should I bring a suit? Because I wasn't sure if there was going to be a funeral. And I was just like, if I bring it, then that means that she's definitely going to die. So I didn't, and she died, and then I didn't have a suit. So then you feel like guilty for even thinking something like that. So I can understand that whole dynamic, which comes back to, you could see yourself in a lot of the characters that were in that movie. But yeah, it was just kind of an interesting thing for them to say.
That made me think of the fact that the studio itself that made this movie thought it was, quote, too Japanese to go to the international market. And I find that so ironic, because I think that's the exact opposite is how this movie has come to be known, that it's so beloved by so many critics and filmmakers around the world because it is such a universal story, even while it is so specific about these people and where they are. But like, you can see your own story in it. It's just kind of wild to me that someone thought that at the time, that it just wouldn't translate culturally, or just the people wouldn't relate to it or something. It's I don't know, just kind of shocking to me. But
I kind of chalked that up to like the stuff we've kind of already talked about, as far as like the trappings of the film and not the story, just like the pace and the camera angles and the sort of the little cultural things that we've all brought up that like we don't quite get.
Right.
But
Sure.
I mean, how better to learn about a culture than to be exposed to it and expose people to it? I think that's a really stupid criticism.
Well, I also think at the time, like, so the movie came out in 1953, it was still like so post World War II. I think people then going to see movies had a very different attitude about like the Japanese culture and people than we do today. When I think about Japanese culture, World War II is not something that pops into my mind, but obviously for people who had just fought in the war and lost people and stuff, and it was different.
And I mean, I guess also, even though I'm the one who made the argument that they were stupid for thinking this way, like, I guess they are still a studio, so it's understandable that they're going to look at what they have, look what did well before. They're going to see Kurosawa's movies are doing well with an international market and an American market. They're going to think, oh, we need more movies like that to go out there, and those will sell there, and those will do well. And basically Kurosawa, was making movies that were so influenced by the West already, so I could see why they'd think the style of the movie, sure, I get, doesn't necessarily translate right away. We've all talked about how, the things that we noticed about it and all, but the story itself, though, to me is still universal. So it's just kind of a shame that it took them a while to see that it could have an impact. But I'm glad that they eventually moved it over there and let people see it.
Yeah. I think it's sort of like what we talked about with the Magnificent Ambersons too. It's just like it was such a failure when the people watched it in the test screenings. It was just like they weren't used to seeing something played out in that way. And of course, you can't really compare the two movies, but it's sort of like what you said about, the studios, they're there to make money. And if it doesn't grab somebody within the first like 10, 15 minutes, why would we even put our money behind something like this? So it might have been a case like this, because I think all of us, it's not everybody, that's doing the podcast right now. It was sort of like you needed to really pay attention to it at first to get into it. And sometimes I think that people just don't give it a chance like that.
Right.
Can I say something else about the trains?
Please do.
I would love to hear that.
Well, I was thinking about it a lot when you're watching, when I was watching the movie, because it's like, it's clearly such a long, I don't think they ever quite say, but it's like an overnight train ride, and I think like a day and a half, basically. It's like they're waiting for the train, I think like almost 8 p.m. when they're leaving, and they say something about getting there at like 1:30 the next day or something. Yeah. And so it's like, that's like such a long train ride. But I was thinking like, okay, when there wasn't a train, they never would have gone to it would have been like days journey by horse and buggy, I guess, or horse and cart or something. I don't know how people.
I think there's a scene where they talk about that.
Is there? Okay. Yeah. And but it just made me think too, like, today in Japan, I feel like they're so known for having these bullet trains and everything so fast. And like, I don't think of Japan as being this huge place, even though I know like it is. But I think my impression of that comes from like, oh, there's these trains and you can get to all the major cities. So just thinking again about like the, the progress and the moving forward, the post-war era, and also about our terrible infrastructure here in this country.
Well, I did look up the distance, and I think it said it took 4.5 hours for a train, but it took 9 hours if you drove to their house from Tokyo to where the couple lived.
Oh.
Maybe
today.
the
I looked it up on
and-
Google.
yeah.
I looked it up on Google.
Yeah.
So
right.
So that's why I was just saying, like, the progress is definitely different now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And
That's
even
cool
driving
that you
is
did
probably,
that though.
I was just curious because I wasn't sure where they were
What's that
situated.
time?
Well, I watched the movie twice, and so the second time I was like, how far is it? So then I just looked it up. And of course it's by today, but I was just saying in terms of like progress. It's still 9 hours to drive though.
So what was everyone's favorite scene or moment or element of the movie?
Well, there's one scene I did like when they were at the spa and like the young people were having a really good time. I really enjoyed that. And they were kind of like, why are we here? Because it just felt like, the times have kind of passed and that's what's happening. But you still saw like some liveliness going on there. I just liked that scene for some reason. And then also the scene where they were sitting outside of the spa and the water was there and they were just sitting on I think it was like a wall. For some reason that really struck me. I just really loved that.
I loved it when they went their separate ways because the daughter kicked them out for the night, and the father got drunk with his two friends, and what all that was uncovered and said, and the inappropriate flirting with the waitress, and then cutting that to Noriko and the mom, and having that quiet, emotional, connected night. I thought that was my favorite part of the film that evening.
I don't know if this is my favorite part, but one scene that will definitely stick with me is when they're all eating lunch or dinner after the funeral, and the older son and older daughter are like, oh no, yeah, we gotta go soon. And then the son that had just come in from Osaka is like, oh yeah, no, I can stay. Oh wait, but no, if you guys are leaving, I'll just go with you. And I was just like, oh my God. Like, and then the older daughter is like, oh, where's that linen kimono?
Yeah.
And like, oh, where's that? And it just, to me, was just so like, oh my God, she's like literally not even cold in the ground, or like barely cremated if that's what they were doing. But like, just, and you're just being such total shits, and like, just, you can't even give your dad like 24 hours here. So
It's so gross, but how many times have we all seen that with someone who's passed?
Yes.
It's just
Yes.
like,
Yes. Where's mom's pearls?
seriously, we're doing this now.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh my
no, and
gosh.
it felt very like, I think I've been at this table before. Like,
I know. I can't tell you. It's kind of interesting. Like watching this, I was like, oh my God.
Well, I really liked two things. The straight to camera shots, which there were a lot of, and kind of took me aback in the beginning of the movie because I didn't know those were going to be part of this. I always associate straight to camera shots with Jonathan Demme, who's famous for using them in his movies. Like he always likes to try to have one shot at least in any scene where you get into a character's POV. But these aren't POV shots. They're not from any character's perspective. It's or maybe they are, but it's not like that's not the purpose of it. It's just sort of this different way of presenting the characters. And I also really liked when the kids were gathering in their hometown, and after the mother had passed and they were gathered around her body, the shot was just this striking shot where every person was in the perfect place in the frame. And it just sort of made me realize how good Ozu is at just composing a shot. I'd already noticed that plenty in the film, but like this was just the stunning shot of I don't know how many people were in there at that point, like 5 people.
Agreed.
And it's just such a good shot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Cool.
As I mentioned, yeah, mine was just the train, the Noriko on the train leaving at the end. Like,
With the watch.
yeah.
That was beautiful. I mean, she was beautiful. You could just watch her
Mhm.
there, I
Mhm.
think.
It just kind of summed up the whole it just kind of summed up the whole thing of the whole movie for me.
It sounds like we all enjoyed this movie. Sounds like we think it more or less stood the test of time. I mean, I think for some of these movies, it's going to be like, why are we asking that question? There's a reason it's been on this list at the top of the list or near it for so long. I think once we get deeper into this series, there'll be movies that no one's heard of that we might watch, and like it'll be a little more interesting with those. But I guess, like, is there any more to be said about how this movie resonates with us today, or do we just let what we've already said speak for itself?
I suppose there's, especially with things like Nomadland getting all these awards, talking about, because those films mostly are older people. And it's just the idea of capitalism and what happens with the elderly could be, something that we could go into, but I don't necessarily know if that's like a whole other, can of worms that we might not necessarily want to, but I think that there is an idea of the discarded, and how society deals with them, and how that's still very relevant versus different ways of dealing with it in different cultures.
Right.
I mean, look at COVID, and especially like the New York nursing home scandal going on right now and stuff. It's just like
Expendables.
Yeah, totally.
Unfortunately,
yeah,
just terrible.
Expendables, unless they're like in Florida, for example, they were for so long were the only people, or at least mainly the only people being vaccinated were elderly people. And it's like Expendables, except when you need their votes for things, which is just like so despicable to me.
So, if nobody has anything else to say about Tokyo Story right now, Mia, you had our bonus question for this week. Do you want to tell us what it was?
So the bonus question was, what movie setting made you want to travel there, and have you actually gone or not? And I thought of this because when we were last recording, Alicia was talking about how she'd been to Japan, so she was excited to see this movie. And I have missed traveling so much this past year. Normally I travel a lot for work and travel a lot for fun, and so many movies have made me want to go to places. So yeah, that was why I had the question, and I thought we had some really good responses. Everyone wants to go to Italy, apparently.
Apparently, yeah. Really.
Well, do we want to share our answers?
Yeah, we do. Mia, you go.
Oh my God. My list was so long. I don't want to go first. There was just so
maybe
many.
Narrow it down.
Yeah, I know. Let me think for a minute. Someone else go first. Laura.
I wanted to pick a really cool Godard film, and go with Paris, which I'd never been, but I have to be truthful, and I picked a movie that is not a favorite. It's a good rom-com. It's called Singles. It came out in 1992, based in Seattle. It's interwoven friends dating each other scene thing. And I was 17 when it came out. I was living in Queens. I was fucking miserable. And, the world, even though New York, you think it's just the be all end all of everything, but there's quite provincial areas. And I felt very sequestered with a whole bunch of people that I didn't understand or know. And I just remember watching that movie and not relating to the characters as much as I related to everyone else in the room, like at the clubs, the music, and just knowing that I had to go there at some point. And I did. I spent about 6.5 years in Seattle after I got out of college. That was mine.
And Steven?
I did put one in the Facebook page that it was true, but the real one it's Room with a View, and because everybody was saying Italy, I thought I'd be a little bit different, but it is Room with a View, and it's funny because I was actually in Florence when I saw that for the first time, so it was really great because that was the movie that they introduced you to Florence with on my Year Abroad program. And it was so gratifying to watch something and then being able to walk outside and see exactly what you saw on the screen. So it was just it made me want to go there, but at the same time, I was actually there. So it was
bonus.
Really great. Yeah. So great.
Well, I was one of the people who said Italy because of the Steve Coogan movie Trip to Italy, second in that series of his movies.
The second one, not the first one?
The second one. The first one was just going around England, which I still want to go to, but the second one was the one where I was like, why haven't I not gone to any of these places before, and when am I going? Because it's just beautiful vistas, and amazing food, which is what those movies are based around. If you haven't seen them, I do recommend them. They're probably not for everybody, but I enjoy them. And Alicia, what about you?
I love all three of your picks, and I love Italy. But that's not my choice because I have been there. But my choice was the movie Shirley Valentine, which I saw when I was I think I was 13 when I saw it. And it's just basically, it's kind of like how Stella got her groove back before how Stella got her groove back. It's like the white middle-aged British lady that is tired of her husband and tired of her kind of boring life, kind of middle-class life. And she goes on a trip to Greece with her friend, and her friend just basically meets a guy and abandons her as soon as they get there. And then she kind of goes and does her own thing, and she meets someone too. And it's so beautiful. Even still, if I see it now, the beauty of Greece is just still so it just makes me want to go there so much. It just
I
really
love that movie.
Yeah, I just love it. And I still have never been to Greece, so that's still on my bucket list, hopefully someday.
Yeah, so I had a whole list online, but I'm going to go old school. And when I was a kid, I loved Raiders of the Lost Ark. It was hands down my favorite movie. And I have always wanted to go to Egypt. I was really into mummies and that stuff when I was a kid too. My friend and I would mummify bugs in the yard, mummify, quote unquote, bugs in the yard. With,
How does
what
one
does that mean?
mummify a bug?
Yeah,
Well,
I know. Tell us more.
We'd find dead bugs, and then we would get flower petals and mash them for the juices, and we were we're anointing the body, and would wrap it up
Wow.
in leaves and have
So
burials.
creepy.
Yeah, I know.
This sounds
I
like a lot of
love
work.
it.
Sounds like a lot of work,
Weird.
Mia.
But yeah, it was
Making mud pies.
I mean that too, but yeah, I'm sure there was some mud. I feel like we were either playing Little House on the Prairie, which if this question was what book setting makes you want to go places, Little House on the Prairie would definitely be that whole series. Love, obsessed still. But anyways, yeah, I just have always wanted to go to Egypt. There's probably other places that they filmed Raiders of the Lost Ark that are not, I think it was Tunisia actually too when I was looking this up. But yeah, haven't made it there yet. Would really, really love to go. So yeah.
You have to go now.
Mm.
But, I mean, you got to mummify some bug.
Oh my God. Mummify me
Egypt.
when I'm gone, please.
Amazing.
No thanks.
Save up for that sarcophagus now, I guess.
Right? Yeah.
You know what Mia's final wishes are.
Play
I thought we're
somewhere out
discussing this
there
now.
and
How did we not know before?
I was also
Proud.
surprised because when I was talking to Jeremiah about this and was oh, I have my question, I was so many people are going to say New York stuff because I feel for so many of us who didn't grow up in New York but moved there, it's you see it in movies, you see it in music, you see it in all this. And I realized for me, probably my moving to New York thing would be Sex and the City, obviously not a movie. But yeah, I was just surprised given
That people didn't say that?
Yeah, given
You want to know why they didn't?
yeah.
It's because Woody Allen's pedophile. And nobody wants to talk about those movies, even though they're amazing and they,
He's the only person who's ever made movies in New York.
but those are the best. I mean, those. I
They're up
hate
there.
them, but
Yeah.
those movies are incredible.
I did wonder if that was part of it, or
I think it is.
yeah, or
Yeah.
also I figure a lot of people in New York have just been trapped there for the last year, so they might be more
Yeah.
Italy,
Yeah.
Greece,
They're why did this movie make me want to move here?
yeah.
So we posed the question, of course, to our Facebook group, and here are some of the answers we got. Becky said Before Sunrise made her want to see Vienna, and so far she has not yet. So I guess we encourage her to do that when she can. Justin said A Bigger Splash did it for him.
What movie is that?
I have not seen it, so I couldn't tell you, but it is set in Italy. So
Okay.
another vote for Italy. Jess said Rome because of the lovely Roman holiday, so another vote for Italy. Charlie said Must Be Something About Italy. There's a webpage marking some of the locations of bicycle thieves, and when he was in Rome, he hunted down most of them, and they were reasonably accessible. I would do that.
That's
just
a
me.
really cool thing to do.
Yeah.
And then Gavin, jokingly, I guess, said 2001 because he hasn't made it to Jupiter yet. Also, The Lord of the Rings. And he said he would actually love to go to New Zealand. And a couple of TV shows also deepened that urge. So our next episode is my pick. It's Rashomon. It's directed by Akira Kurosawa. It was released in 1950 in Japan and came here to the United States in 1951. It is available to watch with an HBO Max or Criterion Channel subscription, and it's also rentable on Amazon or Apple TV. And like we said before, the Stereoactive Movie Club isn't supposed to be just the five of us chatting. We want it to be an open discussion for people who want to be included. So please do watch Rashomon and share your thoughts. You can do that by joining our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Stereoactive Movie Club, or you can email us at stereoactivemovieclub@gmail.com, or you can send us a voice message at our show page at anchor.fm/Stereoactive Movie Club. So, bye everybody.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
This podcast is produced by Stereoactive Media.